Very happy to see all of you. I understand we're competing with the men's group. So I'm very grateful that you're here. And I realize that I haven't been doing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of these lectures, so I will do that now. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. So now we have Henry Matthews talking about Louis Sullivan and the Chicago School. Welcome,
Henry. Thank you for coming. Right. Chicago was very important in the history of American architecture for various reasons, which I think will come clear. And Sullivan was not the only important architect. There were others, but he was, as it were, the intellectual leader who spoke the vital words that rang through people's heads as they pursued their profession. Sullivan was born in Boston, and he was interested in architecture, and MIT was the only school of architecture in the country. But somehow Sullivan didn't like being in a classroom very much, and he quickly decided that he'd rather work. So he worked for an architect named Frank Furness, who's a pretty important architect in Philadelphia. But because of the depression that was going on at that time, Furness was running out of work, and he moved to Chicago. And there had been a fire in Chicago which had pretty well burnt down the city center. And so architects had lots of work. And for a while, he worked for an architect named William Le Baron Jenny, who was one of the first to use a steel frame. And he is credited with the first skyscraper, though whether we would consider it actually scraped the sky like some of the buildings we see out of our windows here, I'm not sure. He decided to go to Paris and study at the École des Beaux-Arts. He would have not, Richardson had already been there. Richardson was the second, but Sullivan was early. And again, classrooms didn't seem to make him feel comfortable, and he began working for a French architect named Vaudremey, who was a lecturer at the École des Beaux-Arts and had obviously seen the talent that Sullivan showed, at least as a draftsman. But within a year, he returned to the United States and went to Chicago, worked for a while with one firm, but was hired by Dankmar Adler, who was an engineer, a businessman, an organizer, someone who had many of the characteristics of a good architect, but needed good draftsmen. And so he hired Sullivan, and within a year or two, he had become a partner in the firm, and they were called Adler and Sullivan. Well, this was the fire that gave them all that work to do. The stockyards, which you'll see in this picture, brought vast revenue, and the city was thriving, but it needed quick work, as you will see in this picture. And this was the moment in the development of American architecture when masonry and that was not enough. masonry needed to be strengthened by being wrapped around a steel frame. And so buildings could be very much lighter than they had been before. They didn't have to carry the whole building on load-bearing walls. So the steel frame made it possible for Sullivan to live his dreams. But there was another element without which there could be no very tall buildings. I live on the 18th floor here, and I hope the elevators always work. It doesn't always look like it, but the elevator was very important. And the world's first safe elevator was developed by Mr. Otis, and I think his name is in our elevators here. So, but at first he couldn't get people to get into elevators because they seemed very unsafe. But here is a picture of an elevator. If you look at the top here, you will see that the cord has broken, but it didn't go all the way to the bottom. So there were various showings of elevators which soothed the minds of people who were thinking of developing tall buildings. Well, I mentioned William the Baron Jenney, for whom Sullivan worked first in Chicago. A little after that, he built the home insurance building, and it was for this building that the word skyscraper was developed. It was greatly exceeded in height in New York, but Chicago was the place where tall buildings with steel frames developed. And Jenney was a pretty good architect, but we're going to see how Sullivan gained some principles which he passed on through his writings and his speeches to architects. Well, Adler and Sullivan got a commission to design a huge auditorium building. The plan was that it would contain not only a large theater, but a hotel and offices. Why not combine a hotel and a theater so that people will come and stay there to go to the theater coming in from the provinces? So this was Sullivan's first design. But then he saw Richardson's influential Marshall Field's wholesale store that I showed you last week. And you can see that it's not nearly as fussy as Sullivan's design for the auditorium. And Sullivan, despite all his architectural inspiration and education, had a little way to go, he realized when he saw the Marshall Field warehouse. So here is the auditorium as it was built, seen from the lakeside. He has increased the number of floors from the Marshall Field warehouse. Let me just put the two together. Oh. I thought I had the two together. Well, this will work. So Richardson had a ground floor with large windows which would have displays in them, and then 3 stories were linked together in a single arch, and 2 stories in smaller arches, and finally there's a different treatment at the top. And you can see how Sullivan exactly did the same thing, though it's a larger and more complex building. On the left, you can see there is a tower, and that was where Adler and Sullivan put their offices. And of course, there was an elevator. And yeah, you can see a fire escape up there. But the rest of the building has internal fire escapes. So here we see where the firm had their office. What a magnificent position with a view out to the lake, quite close by. There's something so satisfactory about the way that these piers between below the first arches soar upwards and then are followed by pairs of arches and a single story. Somehow there's a transition from the ground up, but there is also, as you'll see in a moment, I'll show the ground floor later. There's a wonderful upward thrust and a continuity. But this was all wrapped around a huge auditorium. Adler and Sullivan became experts in theatres. They designed several theatres. I don't have others to show you, but this is a really wonderful one. And it's being also a hotel and an office building. It has a lot of spaces for people to walk through. I had the luck to be in Chicago a few years ago when Les Miserables was on, and I saw it in the Chicago auditorium, and I was really so excited. The space somehow seems to spell magnificence and pleasure. Oh. So we walk through lobbies, up staircases, and we reach upper floors, each of which is filled with character. There's not a lot of ornament, but there's just enough to add richness. There are plain surfaces, but then balustrades of staircases and so on are beautifully ornamented. And he uses lights as a main element in the theatre itself, arches of lights across the ceiling. And then on either side of the stage, there's a half circle, which we can see here, beautifully traced with geometric forms, both curved and straight. I think as we look at Sullivan's work, we will see that he loved to use ornament, but he used it sparingly. As we're walking up a staircase, we can look at the handrails which are close by. But when we get into a larger space, we will find plainer surfaces. So the auditorium was a huge success and brought Adler and Sullivan a good deal of work. And I should mention that Frank Lloyd Wright came as an assistant in his office. He was a naughty boy and moonlighted on the side. He started on his own practice, building houses for other people, and Sullivan eventually got tired of this and let him go. But Wright did a lot of drawings of details in the auditorium, decorative details. He was able to take Sullivan's sketches and make them beautifully articulate, so that craftsmen could work from them. Wright learnt a lot from Sullivan. He called him Lieber Meister. I don't know why he called him Dear Master in German, but he did. And so he set Wright off on his career and then carried on without him. Yes, this is his own house. I'm only showing you the hearth because we shouldn't get distracted on Frank Lloyd Wright now. And while it was suggested that I give 6 lectures, so obviously Frank Lloyd Wright was going to be one of them. And then someone told me, well, Grant Hildebrand has informed us lyrically about Frank Lloyd Wright quite recently. So most people here know quite a bit about Wright. And if not, you can find some of his books in the library. He has a wonderful book called The Wright Space, which is one of the best ever written about Wright. And in a few months, I might change my mind and talk about Wright, and hope that Grant will join me. So Sullivan refined his ideas about tall buildings further. He looked at steel frame buildings, and he realized, well, he looked at office buildings in the city that they had a ground floor which was generally open to the public, usually had shops into it, a generous entrance which beckons people in, and so the base of the building is treated in one way. But then there are many floors that are the same because they need to look the same because they are the same. These are offices, small cells, different from the ground floor. And then you come to the top and the building comes to an end. And of course, the story is needed for ventilation equipment and stuff like that. So how much of that they did in those days, I'm not sure. But it has been pointed out that Sullivan, who loved to tell us that form followed function, people have pointed out that actually there's only a steel frame behind every other column. Is that right, Grant? So does this make him dishonest? Good, I appreciate that. Well, Sullivan was a great writer. He was asked again and again to address the American Institute of Architects and other societies. This is the Guarantee Building in St. Louis. I guess I thought I had a label on it, but I don't. And the Guarantee Building was built for a businessman who apparently was a great scoundrel and was finally had to flee the country. But being good clients is important for us architects. In the Guarantee Building, I couldn't find interior pictures except this one, which shows the light coming down through a light well in the center to light floor, big space down below. This was something that Chicago architects did in various ways, some more intriguing than others. Oh, wait a minute, that's the Guarantee building. I was thinking it was the Wainwright building. Yes, there was the Wainwright building. I can't illustrate that, but here is the Wainwright. Wainwright was the scoundrel. I got it all wrong.
If we omitted from architectural history all buildings in France were scoundrels, considerably reduced number.
And people have waxed lyrical about the Wainwright tomb. Some say it's one of the most perfect pieces of architecture in the whole world. And I did see a video of its interior, which you can look for online if you pursue it far enough. And apparently, Frank Lloyd Wright worked quite a bit on this building and claimed that it was mostly his work. Sullivan tried different configurations of buildings. The Union Trust building in St. Louis has a recess in the center rather than having a complete light well in the center. The building is shaped so that offices look through this area out to the street. Again, he has a system where piers go up, leading to arches at an upper level, and then a couple of floors are different. Sullivan could have gone on and on designing buildings that vary a set of principles, that follow a set of principles, but vary the way that they can be deployed. So this has a courtyard in it, in the center, or a sort of U-shaped. It's a U-shaped building, and light flows down into the ground floor from above. Another of Sullivan's splendid buildings in Chicago is the Carson Perry Scott store, built in 1899 and still standing, looking very fine. He developed a different system here. He emphasized the corner. If you're on the corner of two streets, you can make something of it. And so here is the corner of the building. All the floors rise pretty similarly with a white ceramic material facing them. But the storefront at the corner is in cast iron, and it's a magnificent piece of work. I think this really illustrates how Sullivan could believe that a building should be, as I think he used the word, comely in the nude. But he saw a place for ornament, and this is the corner with the principal entrance to the store, and people are drawn in by looking up and seeing this beautiful work, this beautiful ornament. And who did the drawings of that? I don't know. Wright had long left the office by then. Yeah, he later on had his own practice. Yes, thank you, Grant. So this is another example of how he could design buildings that had similar purposes, but he could give them different expressions, make them unique. Later on, in the early 20th century, work was not so prolific for architects, and he built a number of smaller buildings. He built banks in country towns away from Chicago. Owatonna in Minnesota is where he built the National Farmers Bank. And he approached this kind of smaller building not by shrinking a large building, but by giving it an arch on each facade facing the street that gave it a kind of grandeur. We see a lot of banks built at this time that have Greek porticos on them with Corinthian or Ionic columns to give a sense of magnificence. But I think that Sullivan did this in a more subtle way, rather than just copying this tired old symbol. He gives the building a grandeur. And I don't have a good interior picture. Oops. But you can see that there is a grandeur of scale in this. We see that huge arch emphasized on the inside. And then here's another one, the National Merchants National Bank in Grinnell. I'm not sure is that in Illinois? That's in Iowa. Okay. Well, again, he's used, rather than putting a classical portico on it, he takes the center of one of the facades and does something gorgeous with it. It's, I think we'll look at this next picture. He's taken a simple geometry. He's taken two intersecting squares whose sides continue, and then he's got one on the diagonal. It's not the sort of tired old ornament reproduced again and again and again. He really approached this with a splendid originality. I can't think of recent bank buildings that give me that kind of sensation. Well, as I've said, Sullivan was not the only architect in Chicago. Daniel Burnham was one of the leaders, and his partner John Root started the firm Burnham and Root. And I'll only show you a couple of their buildings. The Rookery building, built in 1888. It's not quite as simplified as Sullivan's buildings, but he uses the same elements, similar elements, in a slightly more complex way, and it's rich. The Rookery building also has an astonishing interior. Oh, well, we have to get in there first. Let's look up at this facade again. He uses symmetry. the tripartite buildings, tripartite designs have always been important for architects. The central element, the wings on either side, and then it comes firmly to a stop at the top.
Looked familiar to us. That was the model for the Pioneer Building on Pioneer Square.
Right. I should have brought in a few pictures from Pioneer Square. Only 2 years later. We're quick people, we architects. Like Sullivan, Burnham and Root knew how to do an entrance. This arch is just enlivened with a little bit of ornament. But if you look down at the capitals of the columns, they have features that might remind you of something that I showed you from Richardson. Foliage with birds among it. And then here is the atrium of the Rookery building. I remember the first time I saw it, it was a mess. It had deteriorated horribly. I think they sort of built buildings within it, built spaces within it or something. But it was absolutely a pleasure to go back and see this with light flowing in.
Much of this is by Ray.
Aha.
He did a lot of the interior work here.
Oh, and thank you for telling us that. Look at the details of the staircase. The balustrade with those sort of star-shaped motifs and the freer ornament in gold below. It's so subtle. Who wouldn't want to get married there? And then there's a staircase, one of the most enjoyable staircases I can think of. I thought I had the picture of the whole of the building on the left, which is, and now my mind is, the Monadnock building, which is worth comparing with the steel framed buildings. The Monadnock building was the largest of the buildings with masonry walls. And you can see here how they swell out at the bottom. So they're sort of like bell-bottom pants, which give it a connection with the ground. The subsoil of Chicago was a bit dicey. Near the lake, there was a lot of moisture and gravel and so on, and they worked very hard at the engineering. They built great rafts of steel and masonry on which the buildings could rest, so that they would not sink into the ground. And on the other hand, the Reliance building, which we see, no, I've lost some pictures, but look at, you can just imagine that the Reliance building on the right is much, much lighter. It's just hanging on the steel frame. It's like clothing on a skeleton. So Sullivan, Burnham and Root, and his fellow architects in Chicago felt very secure that they were showing the way towards the future. They really invented modern architecture. They gave it its roots and its bones. And then something happened which seemed magnificent, but it affected the future of architecture very considerably. And that was the world's Columbian Exposition. And who was chief architect? Daniel Burnham, that great modern architect. But given the opportunity, why not go back to the classics? Why not celebrate everything that's proven, that is full of value because of its elaboration, its long years of history? 1893. So here it says 1893. So Chicago, there was a competition between cities, I think, as to who would get the Great Exhibition, and Chicago won. And people came from all over the country and all over the world to it, and they could see what a progressive country America was, with its classical porticos crowned by medieval spires and all kinds of other magnificent architectural features. I love this one. I don't think it actually moved around the lake, but it looks as if it's just about to. Well, that's a good question. Is it made of plaster? A waterproof plaster, probably. But these buildings were wooden scaffolding to which plaster was applied, imitating stone. They were darn good at it. They knew what they could do, what they were up to. And as far as I know, it lasted the time of the exhibition. But these were not seriously solid buildings. They were, in a way, fakes. But I would have been absolutely astonished, and I would have found it absolutely wonderful if I had gone there. Oh, that's absolutely wonderful information. Thank you so much. I wonder how they. I wonder how she got to be chosen. Edith Mentorn. That I'm so glad to know that. Oh. Any other vital pieces of information?
What was the horse's name?
Yes. I thought it was a Roman emperor. I have a few more of these. I love this one with the bridge, and there were gondolas. They used real Venetian gondolas here. But Sullivan was given a building to do, and that was the transportation building. And you can see a lot of Sullivan-esque thinking in this. He wasn't going to return to the classics, He has a great central feature, but it's not a classical portico. Sullivan had used arches before, and he could do arches with a Virgin's arch within arch within arch. And he has plain surfaces, but subtle texture and ornament where it can bring it to life. And so Sullivan definitely didn't sell out in his design of this building. I would think so. It's amazing that they could do all that. Well, while we're looking at expositions, let's not forget the Alaska Yukon Pacific exhibition, which was only a short while afterwards, 1918, and oh, I misread it. I'm glad of that. 1909. That's really good. Yeah, when you look at the buildings, it's got to be 1909. As we look at this bird's eye view, we will see a round pond, and that is the big pool on the UW campus. And sorry? Yes. 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 But this, and there is that axis that leads down to Mount Rainier. So they followed in the footsteps of Chicago up to a point. The architecture is a little more original, perhaps. Well, I'm not sure. And there, among those buildings, was the building that became the School of Architecture. And that was built for the exhibition, wasn't it? That's it, yes. And there were all kinds of things, including, I think, the world's first Ferris wheel. That was somewhere else. That was in... So, that was the Alaska Yukon exhibition. Well, does anyone have any questions? I appreciate the amount of information I'm getting in the discussion. Yes, Grant?
I wanted to make just a comment or two about Sullivan. His phrase, form ever follows function, became a slogan for modernism, but it isn't a slogan that really works. If you just work out the function of a building, you don't really, there are innumerable forms that can follow from a functional analysis. And it's been, I think, rather a curse on architects. It means that you have to invent every time around, and that isn't easy to do. Great architectures have been kits of parts that have been manageable by a number of masters. But we can't blame Sullivan for that. His phrase, form ever follows function, meant something rather different to him. His illustration of that was a rose. He felt that a rose was the ideal of form following function, and you can see that it's not a barren idea at all. And it helps us, I think, to explain the ornamentation, the rich ornamentation that is common to his buildings. You think of that window of the Grinnell Library, and form follows function in only the sense that a grand window punched into a vault should have something going on. So his phrase, I think, became more a problem than a help in ensuing generations. I'll leave it at that. I'm talking too much.
I will move. I'll go on in Sullivan's own words. He was inclined to give grandiose speeches which had enormous effect. Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and that is the law. Where the function does not change, the form does not change. The granite rocks, the ever-brooding hills remain for ages. The lightning lives, comes into shape, and dies in a twinkling. It is the pervading law of all things organic and or inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all manifestations of the head, the heart, and the soul, that the life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function. This is the law. Shall we then daily violate the law of our art? Are we so decadent, so imbecile, simple? It is indeed the truth, so transparent that we see through it but do not see it. Is it really then a very marvelous thing, or is it just so commonplace, so everyday, so near a thing to us that we cannot perceive that the shape, form, outward expression, design, or whatever we may choose of the tall building should be the very nature of things, should be in the very nature of things, follow the functions of the building, and where the function does not change, the form does not change. And he went on for a few more pages. Yes. Well, there's absolutely no doubt that he was an intellectual leader, not just for the architects, but for the city as a whole. And the people were proud to have him as a sort of intellectual leader of architectural issues. Yes. No.
I studied architecture in a modernist era, and we were taught to hold that exhibition in contempt. I no longer do. I think it has wonderful qualities of unity and richness and order that really do speak to a good bit of what value in design. I no longer hold it in contempt at all. I think it was really quite an accomplishment in its own right, different though it was from what Sullivan was doing.
I agree with you, Grant.
And the architecture building is not the only one from the fair, is it?
I think it's the only one.
Only one left, okay. All right, you've got a mic.
I'd like to refer back to Susan's introduction and acknowledgement that we're on native ground here. And as a side note to this explosion of vertical buildings and so forth, up till Sullivan and Otis's elevator, the tallest residential buildings in North America have been around about 1,000 years, and an example is the Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, which there were walk-ups, 5 or 6 stories, and beautiful semicircular campus. Anyway, just interesting.
Yes.
Jane. Here you are. Quick engineering question. Because everyone was trying new things, and I was once told that the technology that that set the path for elevators was first developed by the mining industry, and that technology of going down below the earth with elevators to take workers underground was what was used to transform and build inspired the first elevators to go up. I don't know if all the architects here could tell me about that. Grant, Grant. Cool.
Sounds like something that's very true to me.
I can't answer that, but there is an interesting story about Otis. When the Eiffel Tower was built, there was a statute, an ordinance, that every bit of it should be French. Every bit of it should be French. But the elevators are Otis. Because we were the only nation, the only technology that had developed that far and had confronted the problem of the tall building.
And I suspect that, just bringing in another extraneous fact, the fact that Manhattan was a great chunk of rock on which tall buildings could be built probably was one of the reasons that it became the skyscraper center of the world. They couldn't have done otherwise. Yes.
I should have asked my question when what I wanted to ask about was on the screen, but I think it was the ad for the 1909 exhibition. It had a big circle here with an ocean liner and a train on the right side. Was that the last slide? It was before you went back to all this stuff. Yeah. Well, keep going. It'll come up. Yeah, there it was. No, it's further. It was very colored. It had a million colors in it. No, keep going. It's not this one. I think it was in this series, but early.
Oh yes, this.
It had two.
This.
No, there it is. Okay. The front of the ocean liner looks like it was blown off by a destroyer or something. Does anybody know what gives with that?
What is the pay streak anyway? Anybody know? A game? I guess it's the only thing that's actually on water. Meaning Pacific Ocean.
Ships don't get water up there.
Didn't they bring people from around the world and have them as little ethnic displays in these world fairs?
Yes.
Right? That like people from Samoa or
Pygmies.
even Native Americans too, I think. Isn't that true? Yeah, they were very, uh-oh, sorry.
Who is Bill?
Bill?
Every one of us.
Okay. So I guess that's it.
Well, thank you so much for coming and participating so much.
And
And thanks, Grant, for some of the things I'd forgotten.
next week we're going to hear about Henry's Kirtland Cutter, which I don't think anyone knows more about Kirtland Cutter than Henry. So you will hear a real detailed discussion of the opposite of Louis Sullivan.